Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I curate the cultural events for AFUSA. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Jennifer Dasal on her lecture on American women, art, and the Belle Époque with her new book, The Club. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 26,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French. And please take a look at our little video. Please visit afusa.org and take a look at our upcoming cultural events. Next Thursday, we have a dialogue on Proust's Time Regained. Ferris Preux from the Alliance Française of Greenwich will be speaking with Professor Bill Carter to explore the return to Cambrai. And then we have François Ozon's new film coming up for French Cinematheque with Peter de Bruges, and some wonderful things coming up in November and December that will surprise you with, but please go to afusa.org where they will be up on the website soon. A few logistics and format. Please stay on mute during the presentation. Stay on speaker view, and all questions should be put in the chat. If you have any technical issues, please sign back in after a few minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime is 1 hour. I am really honored to welcome and introduce Jennifer Dasal. Jennifer is an art historian, curator, lecturer, and author, former curator of modern and contemporary art at the North Carolina Museum of Art, NCMA. She's also creator and host of the Art Curious podcast, which was chosen as one of PC Magazine's best podcasts of the year for 3 years in a row, 2018 to 2020. Jennifer is the author of Art Curious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Renee. I am so excited to be here to share the story of what is the topic of my latest book, which is called The Club, where American women artists found refuge in Belle Époque Paris. I am so excited to be here with you. But before we begin, I do have just a very quick question, and that is if any of you had ever heard of The Club. Of course, I don't expect you to raise your hand or to answer, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that the vast majority of you had never heard of this institution that was variously called by a few different names while it was in existence. Sometimes it was called the American Girls Club, sometimes it was called the Girls Art Club, the American Women's Club, the American Women's Art Club. Essentially, every variation that you can think of on those phrases is how it was referred to in daily life and also in the press. So all of them were used pretty interchangeably. I simply call it the club because that's the one word that never seemed to change in the telling of the story of this location. So I'm guessing that you likely, up until hopefully maybe today even, have never heard about the club. And I've got to say that you would not be alone. And when I actually first heard mention of the American Girls Club in Paris, I thought it sounded like historical fiction. This is what I had my lovely AI image generators make some fake book covers for me, and this is what they came back with. I just thought it sounded like a frothy romantic title. And then when I started Googling the terms American Girls Club in Paris, 99, I kid you not, about 99% of the image results I received related to American Girl dolls. And I've got to say, that was not a surprise. The term American Girls Club obviously brought them to mind as well. As an 80s baby myself, it sent me down a nostalgia-filled road for sure. I personally had two of the dolls in this picture, so it definitely touched my heart a little bit. So what was really surprising to me was learning that this was a real place that existed during the Belle Époque and for over 2 decades. it successfully sheltered and supported an entire generation of American women artists. And the beautiful building that housed the club, it's still around today. And I'm going to be interspersing some images of what it looks like now with the historical ones that I'll be sharing with you here and there. The specificity of the club's reason for its existence, that was really what first grabbed my attention when I was learning about this story, because that whole specificity is what really gave its purpose to the club. It was to provide a resting space, a safe place, a community center, basically a community period, specifically for American women artists who were living and working in Paris during this period. And as an art historian whose specialty in French art really backed up explicitly into this period and this realm, I was shocked and a little bit embarrassed that I had not heard of the club before. But then I learned that very few people actually had. So I thought, what better time to change that? So I am so excited to be here with you today to hopefully introduce you to the club. So, first, to understand why the club was really necessary, it is necessary for us to dig in a little bit into the very particular needs that American women experienced as they were studying in Paris during this era, because there were actually several things that they needed. The first is that they were having some financial issues. So, I want to say that, first of all, women from almost every strata of American society did come across and take this giant leap to move to Paris to pursue art studies. I liken it in some ways to going to graduate school. It was considered the final, all important last step in their artistic professionalization. And that was attending a Parisian art school or an atelier. But I've got to say that it is fair to say that not all of them were wealthy by any means. And for anybody, regardless, moving internationally, even if temporarily so, was not an inexpensive prospect. Because not only did you have things like your transatlantic steamer fare to consider, there was also, of course, costs for luggage, potentially even a new wardrobe, a traveling wardrobe, and the like. But on top of all that, women had to reckon with the fact that once they arrived in Paris, their art school fees were typically double what was being charged to their male counterparts, simply because instructors figured that the higher cost would weed out what they called lady hobbyists. That was the actual term that they used. So it was assumed that women who were really serious about pursuing a career in the visual arts would nevertheless come to Paris and pony up that fee. And they did. So then throw in the fact that the Latin Quarter population, the student population, was exploding at the end of the 19th century. And so you have this huge coterie, this huge population, both male and female, from around the world coming especially to study art. And they were all going to be desperate for affordable housing. And then remember the fact that ones that were considered safe, reputable, and suitable for women were, of course, going to be a little bit more expensive. And then think about the fact that hopefully a student would like to have the occasional hot meal. And then you get the idea of a lot of the budgetary restrictions that women artists in Paris were experiencing during this period. These, again, were women who already arrived at the City of Light at a disadvantage. And so they were really determined to scrimp and save every single coin that they could so that they could make their Parisian sojourns last as long as possible so that they could gain the greatest benefits from their educations. During this era, though, we have that financial consciousness, I suppose you could say, financial challenges. But that was also joined by another challenge, and that was the extreme concern of the worried American parent, especially American mothers, that you would hear all about all the time. It was fueled very much by hysterical news reports, and I suppose you could say news in air quotes here. In local and regional newspapers all around the country at the end of the 19th century, you could find a veritable slew of articles on any given week that constantly testified to how American girls And by the way, they would be called girls not because they were minors or underage, but simply because they would be unmarried. But how girls were relegated to renting these heatless garrets and surviving on multiple cups of tea instead of a nice, healthful meal just to make their pennies go that much further in Paris. And this story of near starvation was, by the way, often described as one of the best case scenarios in these news reports. Tandem to these reports were all of these horror stories of death and disease. There were many stories of women who were drowning themselves in the Seine because they got ill or because they were lonely, or in multiple cases, because they were apparently despondent that they could not go forward and reach their dreams. They literally could not afford to reach those dreams. And then let's talk about that dream briefly. The dream of becoming a painter or a miniaturist, a sculptor. To a lot of Americans, especially during this era, these seemed to be a little bit of a fruitless endeavor because, first of all, competition in the visual arts, competition to become a professional artist at this point was so fierce. And then also, it seemed so contrary to the long assumed pinnacle that many American families still held for a woman's existence. And that was, of course, being a wife and a mother. So I think, is it any wonder that after reading all of these tales of woe, that American families were kind of loath to let their grown children move to Paris, let alone, I think, really paying for the privilege of them doing so. So that's stage setting here. But let's say that we finally have a determined and a resourceful, well enough off American girl who finally was able to go far enough to convince herself and hopefully convince her family that she could move to Paris and successfully manage her meager budget upon arrival. That should be smooth sailing, right? Sadly, no. Because those same American newspapers and books, like the one you're seeing here on the screen called Paris Unveiled, again asserted in article upon article the many dangers that was sure to befall anyone who went to Paris. There was a wonderful book that I read by a historian named Eugene Weber who highlighted the perils that was common during this era. And he wrote, quote, juvenile delinquency was rampant, shoplifting commonplace. Assault and murder seemed to be everywhere. Poison, acid throwing, hammer blows, knives and hatchets of every kind, canes, cudgels, truncheons, garrots, lassos, sword sticks, shotguns, and revolvers, unquote. So Paris was essentially deemed to be hazardous for everyone at this point, but of course, women were really seen as being the most vulnerable. So much so that by the 1870s and 1880s, even the popular Baedeker's Guidebook to the City of Light started issuing warnings specifically to women regarding the avoidance of certain activities and certain areas of town where they said they missed being harassed or misunderstood. So it really was made clear, especially in the press, that Paris was really anything but safe for young women, especially young foreign women. And I'm not even getting the opportunity really today to touch on the fact that there was a seriously negative perception of American girls specifically during this era. This was decades before the term ugly American was coined, where American women, especially young unmarried women, were often dismissed by both the French and Americans as Daisy Millers. So they were named after the flighty, doomed Henry James protagonist. I think she's probably more accurately a cautionary tale. So we can see that American girls were actually up against a lot in brief. And it was also they could pursue their hopes of becoming a legitimate professional American artist. So I think it became clear very early on in the 1880s that they could use a little help. They could use a place where they could get an inexpensive but healthy meal, a safe place to congregate, a place they could connect with a sympathetic friend. So enter two amazing women who came together and formed an idea. The first is this lady. This is Helen Pert Newell. She was the wife of an Episcopal clergyman who was associated with the largest American church associated with the French, and that was the American Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. It's still around today. It's called the American Cathedral in Paris today. And Mrs. Newell, in her role as the wife of a clergyman, she had witnessed the trials of American girls firsthand because she and her husband specifically set out to minister to the student community, especially American students. And she later recalled a time that she paid a visit to one of these young women that she got to meet in the course of her daily work. And according to Newell, when she was welcomed to the woman's room that she had rented, she walked through the door and the young lady said, "Oh, please don't loosen your cloak because I took a room that has no chimney because I don't want to be tempted to have a fire." According to Mrs. Newell, though, the girl later ended up thinking that this all worked out for the best. The suffering was worth it. It had paid off because later that year, the woman had basically been rewarded by the fact that her artwork was accepted at that year's Paris Salon, the end all be all art exhibition in the world at this point. But this experience really shook Mrs. Newell because she quickly realized that even the work that she and her husband were doing to minister to American students, it was obvious that American girls needed more still. They needed more than they were being given at this point. So in the early 1890s, she paired up with this woman. This is the California born philanthropist Elizabeth Mills Reed. And Reed had moved to Paris in 1889 when her husband, Whitelaw Reed, was named the minister to France under President Benjamin Harrison. And for me, in my opinion, Elizabeth Mills Reed was really perfectly positioned to be sympathetic to the challenges that American girls specifically experienced because she had once been one of them. She had actually lived in Paris during her own high school years. And at this point, she, as you can see in this image, she was also a mother to two young children, including a little girl. She also had the financial backing to do something about women's struggles while living in Paris because she was born into one of the wealthiest families in California during this era. Her father was a man named D.O. Mills who had made just a mint in the gold rush and had also become an early investor in both the railroads and also was the founder of the First Bank of California. So Elizabeth Mills Reed, having this familial background, she had the cash to help. So she got together with Helen Pert Newell, and they really began very small at first. In 1891, they rented a little apartment on the Rue Vavin in the Latin Quarter, and they decided that they wanted to pull together just a little ad hoc gathering space. And the idea was that any American woman, as long as she was about between the ages of 18 and 40 or 45, and she was in Paris specifically to study art or music, although art was by far the runaway hit of those two categories, they could come to this apartment and they could savor a warm cup of tea. They could come and look at the English language periodicals, both newspapers and magazines that they kept stocked at the apartment. And then, of course, if women felt so inclined, they could come in on Sunday nights and enjoy a church service that was led by Mrs. Newell's husband, the Reverend Newell. And so they really envisioned this as a place where young, like minded students could gather safely and happily, a place specifically for women, and then have a little enjoyable free sustenance also. And then thinking about things like the shared language in a foreign land, the camaraderie of experiencing a similar goal of this professionalization in the visual arts. That was all envisioned as part of the package. So this is how the club began, this little version. It would soon go on to be known as the club, the American Girls Club, because it strangely enough became an immediate word of mouth sensation. So popular had it become by the end of 1891 and into early 1892 that Newell and Reed really quickly realized that they needed something bigger to cater to the needs of this continually growing community. So the following year, 1892, Reed moved forward, wielding, her pocketbook as much as her ambition, and she began making plans to secure a larger, more permanent space for an expanded version of the club. And this is the club that would soon be known really around the world. So, not long before Mills Reed and her family moved back to the United States because her husband had completed his role as minister to France, Elizabeth Reed found what she considered to be the perfect place for this updated version of the club. She found a beautiful 18th century abode on a quiet residential street, the Rue de Chevreuse, in the 6th arrondissement. And she really thought that it was perfect because it was located just around the corner from several art schools, art ateliers, and it was also really close to so many of the things that a student might need. So things like well-pointed art supply shops, including ones that were American run and were dedicated to American art students. There were plenty of inexpensive but decent cafes in the area. And then it was only really a stone's throw from the Luxembourg Gardens, which was really considered one of the prime locations in the city to sketch en plein air out in the open, which was, of course, I think a nice free alternative to paying admission to go to the Louvre when you could just study and draw from the sculptures in the garden itself. The property also had a unique benefit in that it had also served for about a decade or so prior as a boys' boarding school. So at this era, it was also properly already outfitted to be a residence for several dozen individuals. And on top of all of that, I think it doesn't hurt that it was pretty eye-catching. It was comprised of 4 stories, and it was described at the time in contemporary literature as being a rambling old structure of almost 100 rooms. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. It was definitely not quite 100, but still, it wrapped, as you can see from this old postcard, it wrapped around on 3 sides of an interior flagstone courtyard, and it had some wonderful wisteria-bedecked balconies and verandas in the springtime that you could stand and overlook this space into what you're seeing beyond the fence here into a courtyard and a little garden beyond. So when Elizabeth Mills Reed saw this, she opted to lease the site almost immediately. And she paid for a small round of renovations to spruce up the property, particularly, I think, because it was previously a place for boys. So I think she wanted to clean it up a little bit. And then the newly upgraded American Girls Club in Paris officially opened to the public in the fall of 1893. The Rue de Chevreuse property, I think, really improved upon what Mrs. Newell and Elizabeth Mills Reed originally had of their version of what the club could be. And that was obviously exactly what Mills Reed herself had planned in leasing this larger space. And it was significantly larger. The original footprint of the building had actually not changed very much since the 18th century, and it housed over 40 residential rooms. So not 100 rooms for women, but obviously plenty enough space so that you could house several dozen individuals, maybe 50 or 60 women, depending on if women wanted to rent their own room or if they wanted to share between 1 or 2 individuals. It also had private reception spaces, storage facilities, and enough space that a concierge could live on site as well. And then there were also some really inviting public spaces that would be open and available to anyone who wanted to come by. And that included particularly its library and its reading room. And all of these were listed in the press as being just really beautiful and very gently elegant and cultivated. They really became some of the most sought after locations for going and visiting and having a cup of tea, for example, which I'll talk about more in a moment. The library, in particularly, I love reading about. In its earliest days, the library was noted to have about 600 books, forming, quote, a fine and comprehensive library with 2 valuable divisions devoted to French literature and art. And that was per a 1909 article in Town and Country. The library was actually expanded quite a bit in the early 1910s, but I think this version, the earlier 19 1890s version sounds especially cozy because in contemporary press, you'd read about the fact that they had a rocking chair that was seated adjacent to a glowing fireplace, which just sounds delightful to me. Nearby the reading room, which is actually this picture that you're seeing here, the reading room supplied, just as in its previous iteration in the smaller apartment version, a bunch of French and English language periodicals that would often be spread across a central table where women could also sit, and they often wrote letters home at the table or occasionally even took French lessons from tutors who would come in on site. I always think, though, it's not like there's often a lot of examples. I think this picture, as we can tell, is obviously quite staged. Apparently, there was not a lot of time for women to go and enjoy those periodicals because, as one resident confessed in a letter to her mother in 1909, she wrote, quote, "We have all the American magazines and papers here at the club and a large library, but no time to read." That is per an Albany-based sculptor named Alice Morgan Wright. So I think the life of a busy art student probably didn't allow so much time for seated reflection and reading necessarily. But of course, the library and the reading rooms very helpfully also acted as community centers and information databases in some ways, you could even say, because they also contained things like a bulletin board that was brimming with all kinds of useful information. You know, everything from details of English language church services, summer sketching classes, the addresses of dentists, doctors, French teachers, rooms for let, for example. And even students mentioned that they would sell their furniture if they were moving out of the club or out of away from France and back home as well. And all of this was noted in an 1894 article by another club resident, a woman named Elizabeth Taylor. And I always say, not that Elizabeth Taylor, a different one. But we can see how the club really functioned as a hub that connected its members, of course, not only to one another, but also to the greater Paris and all of its communities beyond its walls as well. The club's rooms, if people did choose to live on site, you could become a member without living on site. But if you wanted to live at the club, you could rent a standard sized room for about 35 francs a month. But if you wanted to go smaller, I kind of think of it as like the club's version of a bohemian garret, you could rent that for 25 francs. And then an extra large space that was meant to be shared between 2 to 3 women could retail at about 60 francs a month. So the average cost, doing some calculations for that standard sized room, equaled just about $6 a month. So in a city that was solidly considered unaffordable for many, even in the 19th century, the rooms at the club were a steal. And so the bargain aspect of living at the club was highly praised. I do have to say that at this earlier era in the club, it did not include things like coal or wood for heating. And in the earliest years, the first decade and a half or so of the club's existence, it also did not have plumbing. So if women wanted to enjoy a bath, they went and had what they called a ducking at a local bathhouse whenever they felt the need to freshen up. So that was one thing that they would later improve upon. The rooms at the club were, believe it or not, rather bare bones in that they were offered a futon and for sleeping and really not that much else. But there were two little luxuries that were written about constantly in both the French and American press. And I think they formed what I consider to be the central club experience. And that was the afternoon tea that they held every day at 5 p.m. And then also the club's on site restaurant, because women could choose, not just the women members, but actually anyone could come to the club. And if they so chose, they could have every single one of their meals, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, all of the above, from whom the press referred to as trim, spotless woman servants. And that's who you're seeing in this illustration here from an 1894 article on the club. And all of this, just like the rooms, were given at a ridiculously low price. And all of this just caused an incredible sensation. So much so that it's really funny to go through archives of newspapers from this era because US newspapers, when they would write about the club, which was not infrequently, they would often print sample menus along with currency conversions so that people could get a sense that the daughters of the American Girls Club would eat beefsteak garni, for example, for 8 cents, and they could have mashed potatoes for just 3. So we can imagine that at these kind of exchanges, that the club's restaurants remained really consistently busy throughout its existence. And that, of course, then brings me over to the afternoon tea. This was like the library and the periodicals, both English language and French periodicals, was one of the things that was carried over from the earliest iterations of the club in that small apartment. So lauded was this afternoon tea that it was mentioned in basically every single article that I was able to locate about the club, all of them filled with these rapturous descriptions of everything from the delicate blue and white china that they used for place settings to this incredible large brass samovar that stood in the corner of the room. And like its on site restaurant, the club's tea served not only members and residents, but also the general public, including not only just Americans, but also the French public if they wanted to come in. So, again, this provided art students with a really important opportunity to mingle with other students, including men art students as well, expats, tourists. If they had family or friends visiting from the US, they would often come and enjoy tea or the restaurant at the club. And what's really interesting to me is that I started reading some notes that said that even though there was a very large British population in Paris during this era, and that was the largest expat community with Americans coming separate, the girls' club tea became such a phenomenon that the idea of American 5 o'clock tea started spreading into the French community at this point, and it became known phonemically as 5 o'clock tea, which I just find delightful. So, this focus on community that the tea provided, I've got to say, was something that was not only so well received by the club's members and visitors, but it was also something that was incredibly important to Elizabeth Mills Reed, the philanthropist. So much so that she actually funded afternoon tea entirely by herself over 20 years worth of daily teas. So for over 20 years, no one, whether they were a member or just someone walking off and visiting, no one paid a single dime for afternoon tea, which I think is quite lovely. So, lest it appear that the club was like an idyllic wonderland for American women, it did, of course, assert a few rules and regulations, especially for the women who did choose to live on site. So, for example, the lights at the club's social areas were extinguished every night by 10 o'clock on the dot. And of course, by then, all guests and visitors must have already exited the property. And I've got to say that this particular rule was mostly aimed at guests of the female variety, but this was something that was left unstated but nevertheless understood because male callers, of course, as they were called, they were welcome to come and visit at the club, but they were only allowed to do so at very restricted and very specific hours. And they were only able to visit in the club's public spaces, like the tea room. They were never allowed in a resident's private space. Then things like the keys, room keys, as in most hotels of the day, and also in a lot of hotels even today. Once you exited, you had to leave your keys at a desk in the foyer whenever you departed. And that was regardless of where you were going. Residents could be going across the street to go to one of the ateliers, or they could be going out for an evening to see, a performance by Isadora Duncan, for example. So you needed to confirm to the concierge where you were going, how long you expected to be gone for, and especially who you were planning on being there with. So all of these strictures were very important. And in this newspaper article from the Hartford Journal in 1895 was a line that I found really interesting. And I think that's quite telling that good conduct was more thought of than the ability to pay one's board at the club. You had to act appropriately to be a member and particularly a resident of the club. What I think is most ingenious is that in a lot of these newspaper articles and magazine reports about the club during this era, these rules were reproduced, just like those menus that were reproduced. A lot of articles also talked about all these regulations that were stipulated for the club. And I think that was a really savvy move because what that did is that it further endeared especially nervous parents back home in the US. So it was this place that was guaranteeing a level of protection, matronly supervision by the directress and the concierge who lived on site. And so it really asserted the ongoing support of the club as really one of the best places that American girls could go to during this period. And I think this was a feat that it made pretty easily. So within those 2 decades that the club was open, the American Girls Club functioned at or right near capacity for almost the entire time. So the club was viewed really as ideal across the board, not just for the American girls who were coming to Paris, but obviously for their concerned friends and family back home as well. And then the existence of club life, obviously, it was so popular. It also became so cherished that things like the tea that they held in the afternoons, the experience of being in the library, the courtyards, the garden behind the club, all of this started making its way into the members' artworks during this period. So, unfortunately, this work no longer exists, at least it's lost up to this point, but it was a reproduction called 5 O'Clock Tea by Ida Sedgwick proper. And if you end up getting a copy of my book, you'll see that there's this beautiful painting on the cover here. And this is a painting, actually, oh, sorry, here's another painting of the beautiful garden. This one is a painting of the club's courtyard by an artist named Anne Goldthwait, who was an Alabama-born painter, who's one of the several artists I highlight in the book. And here's a picture of that same courtyard today. So, of the many benefits that the club really provided, here's an image of Anne Goldthwait herself, really provided to American girls. I think it's obvious that money saving practicalities were really always top as mind. But I think most importantly was also the community that the club provided. Because as I mentioned, you had this like minded community of singularly driven American artists, all coming from the same country, living together abroad, focused on these similar futures. They all were looking to become professional working artists. But of course, it wasn't just the community of the club, but as it is also the community of the greater expatriate community, the greater cultural community, not just the US, but also French community that they were being exposed to. So I want to take Anne Goldthwait, again, whom you see here on the screen, as another example. She moved to Paris in her 30s, so believe it or not, she was on the slightly older side of the cohort of artists who would come and stay at the club. She actually chose to live at the club for several years. And within days of moving to Paris and settling in at the club, she was introduced to none other than Gertrude Stein, the famed American writer and art collector. And Goldthwait, really interestingly, became one of those semi regular visitors to Stein's famed Saturday evening salons that she held with her brother. And so she became personally familiar with the artworks and also the persons of people like Picasso and Matisse. And though Goldthwait never really called herself a modernist per se, it's interesting to see how her artwork changed throughout her Paris tenure, several years that she was there, because we start seeing how her paintings and her etchings start transforming from being more traditional into things that were more post-impressionist, I suppose you could say, as she started actively absorbing the influences of people like Paul Cézanne, whose work she was seeing at the Stein Salon. Then, on top of that, many other club members were also seeking instruction directly from some of the biggest names of the day who were living in Paris. So that included expatriate artists like Daniel Chester French, Augustus St. Gaudens, and Frederick MacMonnies, and just a few of the many examples of people that they could choose to have as their mentors. And also, not only Americans, but also in the case of the great sculptor Midavo Warwick Fuller, who's one of my favorite artists that I talk about in the book from Philadelphia. She sought mentorship by none other than the famous Auguste Rodin. And it's, again, just like in the case of Anne Goldthwait, it's fascinating to see how Warwick's sculptures under Rodin's tutelage become so much more assured, so much more roughly handled. So we can see that her famous mentor's impact really had something to do with her popularity at this point, along with the fact that she sometimes liked to choose what I think is not necessarily grotesque subject matter, but a little bit darker subject matter than many of her club cohorts. And she caused so much of a sensation, this contrast between this really kind of delicate woman from Philadelphia and these darker works that she would create, such as this image of right after Oedipus plucks out his eyeballs, kind of horrifyingly. So much so that the Parisian press gave her a nickname, which was the delicate sculptor of horrors, which I think is just so, I guess not eye catching, ear catching. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I think it's a wonderful and obviously very evocative nickname. On top, excuse me, on top of all of that, though, we also think of the fact that there were all of these opportunities for women to work with other members of the Parisian community, but they also made their own, within the club's walls, their own opportunities for connection and bond building. And that included not only with other artists, of course, but also with other art lovers and potential patrons. And one of the most important things happened really quickly after the club opened at the Rue de Chevreuse in 1893. A large group of club members, about 60 in total, got together and they discussed something that I think is rather compelling. That was the idea of having an art exhibition at the American Girls Club. I mean, it makes perfect sense because that was a club specifically to help American women artists. So the possibility, really, the plan came together very quickly, and they had the idea that they would have a small showing of club members' works. They would hold a free reception, open it to everyone who wanted to come through their doors, and then they would even host a dance to follow. So, of the inaugural exhibition, it opened really only, I think, 2 or 3 months after the club opened. One author wrote about it, and she said, quote, all the students' works of the year is hung in the exhibition gallery, a spacious, finely lit room with polished floor and divans here and there for visitors. For all artistic Paris, male and female, is invited. To exhibition day, the girls look forward all year with intense eagerness the informal criticisms made en passant by some of the most prominent French artists being followed and listened for as suggestions of priceless value. In the evening, there is reception, supper, and a dance to a good Italian string band. Unquote. So this exhibition, and I think more crucially even than that is the obviously the artwork shown therein, it was so well received right off the bat that it was almost immediately declared that it was going to be an annual event, a cornerstone event held at the American Girls Club. And that is how this exhibition became renowned for about 20 years. And to manage the increasingly complex logistics of having this ambitious uh, exhibition of women's art, the American Women's Art Association was founded a couple of years later in 1895, and it was headquartered at the club. And what's really interesting is that it very swiftly transformed into one of the busiest art organizations in the city. And the membership of the AWAA, kind of similar to the club itself, soon grew at an incredible pace, and so much so that it began to include the likes of such major figures in American art like Mary Cassatt, Mary Fairchild McMonnies, Lila Cabot Perry, Anna Klumpke, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and people like uh, Elizabeth Nourse and John Singer Sargent's cousin, for example, Anita Sargent, were among some of its members. And several of these women that you're seeing on screen actually even held leadership positions in the AWAA. So, in those roles, and for example, Mary Cassatt was president, I believe, from 1898 through 1899, and Elizabeth Norse, I believe, held on about a year or so later, took over that presidential role. So in these roles, those leaders, the leadership positions, these women had to frequently visit the American Girls Club for everything from organizational meetings, thinking about like budgetary reports, exhibition planning, all of that. So these are again further opportunities for club women to be exposed to the club's members, to residents, all of that, to this larger and even more settled artistic population of these women who in some cases would go on to be sort of their mentors and forebears. So you can imagine that running into someone like Elizabeth Norse or Mary Cassatt, that could lead from anything to a supportive comment that might change someone's day to offers of mentorship and beyond. Early on, the exhibition functioned in some ways kind of like a student art sale, and the reception's earliest timing in its very earliest years, I think, coincide perfectly with the holiday season. So obviously it was a benefit to everyone, not just the artists, but also gift givers, that they would hold the shows for a long time around December, and then later moved it into the early winter or early springtime. By about 1910, the managers of the Girls Club really determined that this exhibition was so successful, but that there was now an ongoing need for sales support for our AWAA members. And so they allowed a segment of the property at the Girls Club to be used ongoing as a sales room. So again, this is another opportunity that's further meant to promote the professionalization of women artists, especially Americans. And think about what a huge boon that would be to a young student population who's really hoping to get their foot on in the door, for example. That year, early 1910s, I think it's not really a coincidence that Elizabeth Mills Reed, the philanthropist, paid for an extensive renovation of the club's property with a couple of intentions. The first was that she was hoping to increase the number of women who could lodge there at any given time. So she began to up the capacity. And that was not all that Reed really wanted. She very much knew for the reasoning behind the club. It was to support the careers of these soon to be professional artists. And she called them her girls, which I think is just lovely. So you can see that she very much took them into account and really acted personally for them. So she knew of all of the success of the AWAA's yearly exhibition, and so she declared that there were two needs on top of having more rooms. That was that they needed an ongoing open exhibition space, and most importantly, there needed to be dedicated art studios. So in the early 1910s, the Annex was born. And this is what Elizabeth Mills Reed called it. She called it the Annex. It was a structure that she had designed by the Franco-American architect Charlie Knight. And it was designed to have several art studios on the ground, and then configured that above that there would be several new bedrooms that were placed on the story above them. And all of these had wonderful big windows, especially the studio windows that you can see are quite large, all meant to overlook the beautiful garden beyond them. So on construction, here's what the annex looks like today. Upon construction ending in the late October of 1912, the annex, which you can see was done in this lovely buff colored brick, so it was meant to really mimic the original 18th century building. It now consisted of 20 new bedrooms, 6 private art studios, and then a large, what they called a club studio, that was the biggest of their studio rooms and was large enough to permit, they said, usually between 6 to 10 women's time to stand in there and paint together. On top of that, they also finished creating the Grand Salon, which was something that was large enough not only for art exhibitions, but also for things like lectures and performances. And to further comfort and delight, you would also be pleased, I think, to know, just as the club members were, this is what the salon looks like today, by the way. New bathrooms were put in, and the club was finally plumbed so that it had hot and cold water at all times, obviously, huge luxury. And then a small rooftop garden completed the picture. So, in the course of just about 2 years, the club had almost doubled in size. And I think that acts as ample proof to not only the ambition of the women who were frequenting the club, but also to Elizabeth Mills Reed's decision to provide the very best amenities to her girls. And also, not only her girls, but also to the visitors who would walk into the club. So she felt very strongly that she wanted to do what she could to assist and I think even share in their dreams. But that wasn't all that she had in mind. She was fully ready to rededicate herself to the needs of her girls. So, in this exact same time period, nearly 20 years after she signed the lease on the property, she finally purchased it outright. So, the American Girls Club was now fully renovated, redesigned, and it was finally in Elizabeth Mills Reed's hands permanently. So we can see that the club was really ready to enter this new glorious era for American women. Of course, history had some other plans. American women actually only got to enjoy the newly upgraded version of the club for about a year and a half before war was proclaimed during the summer of 1914. So, what would eventually go on, obviously, to be known as World War I, really transformed Paris into a really just dark version, a dark shell of its former vibrant self. And the club was similarly transformed in that way. It was shuttered only days after war was declared. And the majority of the residents who were still on site there, if they had not left prior to war officially being declared, they found their way home on their own pretty quickly. Although there was a news report that I found in August of 1914 that said there was a small coterie of really scrappy few women who declared that they would remain on site living there until they were effectively kicked out by the on site directress. And that was done, by the way, without the knowledge of Elizabeth Mills Reed, who was living back in the US during this era. So the club emptied out, everyone left, but Reed, obviously, she would have wanted and did want all American girls to get out safe and sound, return home if they could to the US. But she did not want the club to remain dark, especially now that she had it fully in her control. She did not want it to be unused during the war. So, after using it for a while as just a French hospital, she eventually handed it over to the American Red Cross, who transformed it into an ARC hospital once America entered the war. And it stayed an American Red Cross hospital for the duration of the war. Just as Mills Reed had been really generous in renovating the club for its specific uses for American artists, she also paid for another round of renovations during this period to completely retrofit it for medical purposes. So that gorgeous grand salon that she had just opened in 1912 actually transformed into an operating room. The art studios were transformed variously into sick rooms, a pharmacy, and then also a sterilizing bay for equipment. And on top of all of that, all of the rooms that the residents once lived in were now being used for recuperation for wounded soldiers. But given all of this, Reed still really held on to the fact that she had rented this building and then purchased this building for an original purpose, for the use of American women artists. And she really held on to this idea even as the war ended and early into the 1920s. In her correspondence, she leaves notes where she's writing to people about these various ideas that she had, all circling about returning this building to the uses of American girls and always returning to the visual arts as the crux of it. But I have to say, the American Girls Club, as the American Girls Art Club, it never reopened. That is not to say that the Rue de Chevreuse has disappeared. Obviously, I've been showing you pictures here today. It still exists. But what ended up happening is that after much deliberation, and that included the deliberation and I think requests by several former club members, and that included people like Catherine S. Dreyer, who was an art patron, who also would go forward and try to jockey for position with Elizabeth Mills Reed herself. They'd often, people like Dreyer came forward and said, please reopen the club exactly as it had been when we were artists, when we were studying art there. But Elizabeth Mills Reed ultimately opted to lease the property to the American Association of University Women. It was later became known by a different name, the American University Women's Club. And this was so that the building could now house not just women artists, but women who were either college students or recent graduates, people who were looking to pursue further education in Paris. That ended up including people like Jacqueline Bouvier, later Jackie Kennedy, who enjoyed what was then renamed Reed Hall, of course, in honor of Elizabeth Mills Reed, when Jackie Bouvier came during her own junior year abroad in 1949. Today, obviously, as I've been saying, the club building still exists. It's associated today with Columbia University and its Columbia Global Centers program, but it houses primarily the offices of scholars and people who work on site. And it does boast several classrooms and meeting areas. That's all of the windows that you were seeing in these images. But it has now been several decades since they've housed a resident or student of any kind. And it's obviously been quite a long time since it's been a building that was directly made to benefit American artists. So you can see that the story of the club is a rather unique place that was developed at a really specific moment in time to meet these particular needs of American women artists. It's been gone now for over 100 years. And the question that I think a lot of us might come to this story with is, why does it matter? Why should we care? And to really consider that question, the true importance of the reason of the club, I think we have to concern ourselves not just with the building of the club itself, but also with that community, the American girls who lived there, the women who were received through the doors. Because the women who crossed its threshold, several of whom I highlight in the book, like some of the women you're seeing on screen here, and that also includes people like Elizabeth Mills Reed herself, they were all shaped by their experiences that they had at the club. The club really was this continually rotating large student population of independent, talented, really very driven young women who were among the first generation to actively receive and seek professionalization in the visual arts in the US. There was a lot more opportunity for French women, for example, before this era, but this is the first time that American women could receive somewhat of a similar version to what male art students were receiving at this point. In, for example, a 1916 article about Anne Goldthwait, whom I talked about, an art reviewer from International Studio magazine said, quote, in spite of isolated women artists in the past, it is not too much to say that this generation is the first to develop the fine arts in women in America, unquote. Then we have to think about the fact that club members were not just important as part of this first serious generation of professional American women artists, but they were also really influential and important when it comes to the next generation of artists. So a sizable portion of the women that we do know about who came through the club, if they continued into having artistic careers, in the post-World War I years, many of them went on to become very well respected and lauded art instructors. And they introduced many others to the beauty, the pleasure, and also the professionalization of the visual arts in the US. And then I want you to consider briefly the timing of these women's return to the US, because it affected how they dealt with museum founders, professors, art patrons, and so on. Because many of these women, if they were returning in the 1910s and 20s, they had the ability, if they went on to become instructors, to teach the next generation of artists. And those people were the mid-century American artists who helped transform the US into the center of the cultural world and beyond. And I realize I'm running low on time here. If I can return to Anne Goldthwait as just a quick example, she taught at the Art Students League in New York City for several decades, and she was one of the only instructors at this point to serve courses for children. And I think there's enough evidence to know that her classes for kids inspired several really interesting visual thinkers to go on and continue and develop their own creativity. And as a child, as one example, none other than Stanley Kubrick came and took watercolor classes and still life courses from Anne Goldthwait. So obviously, I think he ended up being a filmmaker who ended up having a pretty undeniable artistic flair. So the women of the club, I think, understanding their contributions, both major and minor, to the development of American art, I think is really exciting and overdue for reconsideration. And so I hope that with this book, it's just the first step that we might have to going on and trying to remember their lives and their efforts. And I think it's also equally meaningful that we have the opportunity to shine a light on a place like the club itself, this stately old building that provided them a very safe, comfortable, and creative space that they could call their own, and that would allow them the opportunity to experiment and achieve the ability to forge paths before them that really previous generations could not manage. And I think that there is such beauty that can be seen in a place that has such a specific purpose. So I think, may we all be so lucky that we can find a place that's like the club, a supportive place that we can call our own. So I want to thank you very much for allowing me to spend my afternoon with you, spending your afternoon with me. And I would be thrilled to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. We don't have a lot of time, but I think we have time for a couple of questions. I think you answered some of the questions as they came into the chat.
Oh,
Um,
good. Excellent.
so
Hi,
that I think
Polly.
people got their answers in advance. One of I don't think you quite touched on this. Did the club offer any opportunities for connections to art dealers? You mentioned the art shows, but with a woman connected to art dealers, and did they have the choice or the ability to pursue more advanced art studies?
Yes, I think on both accounts, yes. In some cases, art dealers, not only art instructors and art patrons, but dealers would end up going to, for example, the yearly exhibitions at the club. And especially in Mita Warwick and Alice Morgan Wright, a sculptor, and Anne Goldthwait, they all showed at art galleries in Paris during their sojourn there. And so I can only imagine that part of that was them connecting at the club or at least through the club's greater community. And some women did end up staying and having further art studies in Paris. Some women actually didn't even leave during the war and ended up living permanently in France. And then other women still did go back and return and take other classes in the US. It really just depended on where they were in their art journey by the time they ended their studies at the art studios in Paris, if that makes sense. It's a great question.
So another question, which again, I think you answered most of it. Judy wants to know how many of the women went back to America and pursued their art. You speak about these women going back and teaching art, but you've
Yes.
resurrected these incredible artists in Paris. What were the next steps for them aside just from teaching art?
A lot of them did, it's hard for me to justify. I feel like long story short, I have a database of over 450 names of people that I've been able to identify. Some of them we just know by their initials or by the names like Miss Smith. So obviously a huge amount of them have fallen away from, forgotten in history. But there were so many of women that you can find in both regional and larger museums throughout the country. Anne Goldthwait, this work of art is at the Whitney, for example. But a lot of these women did go on to find success in big and small ways. Frances Cranmer Greenman, for example, became a famous painter to the Hollywood elite. She created portraits of people that you can see in LA and Minneapolis. A lot of women were really finding a lot of support for things like garden sculpture at this era, and we're creating these wonderful sculptures that you'll see, including fountains, like in Central Park, for example. So they weren't all just teachers, they also, in some cases, did have some dedicated patrons. And several went on to become art patrons themselves. So I mentioned Catherine Dreyer. She and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney both were in Paris during separate times to take art courses as well, but both of them are more well known not only for their art but for their art patronage as well. So you can see that there's many different areas in which they went on to support the cultural life of the U.S. for sure.
Thank you. So Polly Lyman is asking, this is a follow up. I don't I have your book here, but I didn't look in the bibliography. Where can one access this name of all of the alumni of the club?
Uh, I my editor asked me to cut it because my notes section and my bibliography were too long in the galley version, which is what I'm holding up here. So to make it just a little more accessible, we've cut it. So the Reed Hall, the building that is the club now, they do have an ongoing list that they've added to. We have some different names, but people can find a more expansive list there, or you can reach out to me and I would be happy to share.
All right, Polly will, I'm sure. So let's
Obviously, I'm
take
happy
one
to
or
give
two
it to
more
Polly.
questions. Linda is asking, was there any interaction between any of these women and the more well-known male artists of the time? You spoke about Rodin, but
Yes.
was there any other interaction?
Very much so. Most of them were in this professorial role where they were actively seeking mentorship or taking courses with people like Whistler or St. Gaudens. In one case that I was sadly not able to find a good place to fit into the book, I love the story of a Maine based artist named Mildred Burridge. And she ended up working mostly not in Paris, though she did a stint at the club, but she worked mainly in the American expatriate community in and around Giverny. And she ended up, of course, meeting Monet and becoming involved in his art circles. So, yes, there were a lot of connections. Of course, I mentioned Cassatt, oh, but you're asking more specifically about male artists. Those I think are the big ones that I've come across is Rodin, Monet, and a lot of the American expats.
Well, I think we can end on a wonderful comment that Karen made. She says, "You have told a fascinating story of women helping women. Thank you for the research to bring these connections together." This has been fascinating. You have, as I said to Jennifer when we first started planning this, I think in reading this book, you're reading about something you know nothing about. It's an incredible journey. These are women that have, sort of been relegated to oblivion, and she's brought them to life. You have brought them to life, Jennifer. And I hope everybody takes the time to read this extraordinary book. And we're very, very grateful for the time that you spent with us. And I hope everybody rushes to buy it. It's a fascinating book, and what a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a delight. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with me.
Thank you.
Bye.